At 81 years old, I did something I never imagined I would do. I blocked my own daughter. And the strangest part wasn't that I blocked her. It was that I should have done it 20 years earlier. The nurse had kind eyes. That is the detail I remember most clearly from that night. Not the fluorescent lights or the plastic chair that had been designed by someone who had never sat in one for 4 hours. Not the television mounted in the corner, cycling through news. Nobody in that waiting room was watching. The nurse had kind eyes, and she crouched down slightly when she spoke to me, so that we were at the same level, the way people do when they are trying to make something easier to receive. "Is there anyone we should call?" she said. I looked at her, and then I did something I had not done in years. I went through the list. Not a physical list, the list you carry in your head of the people who constitute your life. The people you've spent decades showing up for, driving to, lending money to, sitting with, defending, excusing, absorbing, accommodating. I went through every name, and I understood, in that plastic chair in that waiting room at 2 a.m, that not one of them was coming. Not because they didn't know I was there, because I had not called them. And the reason I had not called them, the reason I sat with my phone in my hand and scrolled through name after name and put the phone back in my pocket, was that somewhere between arriving at the hospital and sitting in that chair, I had finally admitted something I had been refusing to admit for years. I already knew they wouldn't come. I had always known. "No," I told the nurse. "There's no one." She nodded gently and wrote something on her clipboard and moved on to the next person. And I sat in that chair and I thought about Deiti one itidia. I had spent building a life around people who had never once asked me what I needed. And I made a decision that changed the final chapter of my life completely. I want to tell you about 5 people. Not because they were monsters, because they were something more dangerous than monsters. They were ordinary. They were the kind of people you keep for decades, because removing them requires admitting something about yourself that is harder to face than the damage they cause. And I want to tell you what I finally understood about all 5 of them at once. Stay with me. My name is not important. Call me what you will. An old man, a retired man, a widower. I am 81 years old, and I spent 47 of those years married to a woman named Constance, who was, by any honest measure, the better half of everything we built together. We lived in a quiet town called Millhaven. Nothing remarkable about it. The kind of place where people stay not because it is extraordinary, but because it is theirs. I worked in municipal planning for 32 years. Constance taught music at the high school until she retired and then taught privately from our home until her hands made it difficult. We raised 2 children. We went to church on Sundays and argued about small things on weekdays and loved each other in the durable, unspectacular way of people who have decided that consistency is its own kind of devotion. I was, by temperament, a helper. I want to say that clearly because it is the foundational fact of everything that follows. Not a helper in the sentimental sense, in the practical sense. If something needed doing, I did it. If someone needed something, I provided it. I had been raised by a father who believed that a man's value was measured by what he produced for the people around him. And I had absorbed that belief so completely that I had spent 8 decades unable to distinguish between being generous and being used. Constance saw it. She said once, we were in the kitchen a Sunday morning. She was reading, and I was on the phone helping my daughter navigate another crisis. She put her book down when I hung up and looked at me with the expression she reserved for things she had decided needed saying, even if I wasn't ready to hear them. You know the difference between someone needing you and someone needing what you provide, she said. They're the same thing, I said. She picked up her book. They aren't, she said quietly. And one day, you'll know which one you've been giving your life to. Constance died 4 years before I sat in that hospital waiting room. And one of my deepest regrets is that I never told her she was right before she was gone. My daughter's name is not the name I will use here. Call her Diane. Diane was the child who arrived in the world already complicated, not difficult, complicated. Sensitive in ways that made her childhood harder than her brother's, more affected by things, more easily derailed. I loved her with the specific tenderness of a parent who recognizes something fragile in their child and decides early that their primary job is to protect it. That decision was the beginning of the problem. Because tenderness, applied without boundaries, does not protect people. It teaches them that fragility is currency. And Diane had learned, not deliberately, not maliciously, in the way children learn the things parents teach without intending to teach them, that crisis was the mechanism through which love was delivered. For 20 years, the phone calls followed the same architecture. Dad, a pause, the pause of someone gathering themselves. I need your help. Car troubles, rent emergencies, relationship collapses, job losses, money borrowed and not returned and then borrowed again. I said yes to all of it. I said yes, because that is what fathers do. And because saying no felt like the withdrawal of something fundamental. And because each individual crisis seemed reasonable on its own terms. It was only when I tried to remember the last time Diane had called to ask how I was, not to begin a request, not to preface something she needed, but simply to ask, that I understood how long it had been. I tested it, not deliberately at first. I was going through a difficult week, a health scare, nothing serious, but the kind of thing that sits heavily. And Diane called on the Thursday of that week. Dad, I'm in trouble, she said. Actually, I said, I've had a difficult week myself. Can I tell you about it first? Silence. Then, of course, is everything okay? I began to explain. I got 3 sentences in. God, that sounds hard, she said. I'm sorry, but Dad, I really need to sort this thing out first, because if I don't, I let her finish. I listened to the crisis. I said I would think about what I could do. I hung up. I sat with what had just happened for a long time. She had not asked me a single question. Not one. She had expressed sympathy in the specific, efficient way of someone who needs to get through the sympathy before they can get to the request. And the moment I gave her an opening, the request had come back through it immediately. Dad, I need 20 years of phone calls, 20 years of that opening sentence. And I sat there and I tried to remember the last time she had called with a different one. I couldn't. Victor Ossi had been my closest friend for 41 years. We had met at the Planning Commission meeting in 1983, disagreed loudly about a zoning proposal, and gone for coffee afterward to continue disagreeing in a more comfortable setting. By the end of that coffee, we had agreed on most things and begun a friendship that I believed, for 4 decades, was one of the fixed stars of my life. We met every Thursday morning at a diner called Carver's on the main street of Millhaven. Eggs and coffee, and 2 hours of conversation that ranged across everything: politics, children, the particular indignities of aging, the news, the things neither of us said to anyone else, or so I believed. What I understand now is that Victor did not have conversations. Victor had audiences. The distinction is subtle enough that it took me 40 years to see it clearly, partly because I am slow to recognize things I don't want to recognize, and partly because Victor was genuinely entertaining, genuinely funny, genuinely interested in the world. He was not a boring man performing monologue. He was a vivid man who simply had no real curiosity about anyone other than himself. Every Thursday, I would arrive with something on my mind, a problem I was working through, something I had read, something about Constance I was still processing in the years after her death. I would begin to say it, and Victor would listen for perhaps 30 seconds, the specific listening of a man waiting for a pause, and then something I said would connect to something he wanted to say, and the conversation would pivot, and we would spend the next 90 minutes inside Victor's life, his hip replacement, his eldest son's business venture, his opinion on the new development going up on the south side of town, his grandchildren, his investments, his theory about why the football team was performing below expectations. I told myself this was simply his personality. I told myself that some people are talkers and some are listeners, and that I had always been a listener, and that this was a complementary arrangement rather than an imbalanced one. Then Constance's birthday came, the first one after her death that fell on a Thursday. I arrived at Carver's with the specific heaviness of a man carrying a date that the rest of the world has forgotten.
But that sits in his chest like a stone. I sat down across from Victor. I ordered coffee and I said, "Constance would have turned 78 today." Victor looked at me. 78, he said. "You know who else is turning 78 this year? Hendricks. You remember Hendricks from the planning board in the 90s? I ran into his wife at the pharmacy and she said, I stopped listening, not deliberately, the way you stop hearing something when a louder truth arrives. Victor did not know me. Victor knew the chair I sat in across from him every Thursday. He knew the presence I provided, the attentive face, the responsive laughter, the questions I asked that gave him somewhere to go. He knew the audience. He did not know the man. And sitting across from him on Constance's birthday while he talked about someone from the planning board in the 90s, I understood that 41 years of Thursday mornings had been a performance I had been attending without realizing I was the only one of us doing any real work. I need you to stay with me here because this is where the story changes direction. If you are watching this and you recognize something in what I am describing, like this video right now, because what comes next is the part that nobody talks about, and it is the most important part. My sister-in-law, Constance's younger sister, I will call her Norma. Norma loved Constance. I believe that completely and without reservation. Whatever I am about to tell you does not alter that fact. She loved her sister and she grieved her sister, and in the years after Constance died, she maintained a presence in my life that I initially understood as loyalty to Constance's memory. Norma visited every few weeks. She brought food, good food, carefully made, and she sat in my kitchen and we talked about Constance and about the family and about how I was managing, and I was grateful for it, genuinely grateful. But Norma had a particular quality that I had noticed throughout the 37 years I had known her and had always found mildly uncomfortable and never quite named. She delivered criticism in the specific dialect of concern. Every observation about your life was framed as worry about your well-being. Every correction was prefaced with, "I'm only saying this because I care." I worry about you eating alone every night. said while examining my refrigerator in a way that communicated she had found it wanting. I just think Constance would have wanted the house kept a certain way, said while looking at the living room with an expression that communicated a verdict. I hope you're not isolating yourself. It's very easy at your age to, said in the voice of someone who has decided that your choices are symptoms. I absorbed all of it, the way I absorbed everything. I told myself she meant well. I told myself grief made people say clumsy things. I told myself that Norma's version of love had always come wrapped in assessment and that this was simply who she was. Then one afternoon, I'd been having a particularly difficult week, the anniversary of Constance's diagnosis, a date I carried heavily. Norma sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You know, if Constance were still here, she would have handled all of this so much better than you have." She said it gently, helpfully, in the voice of someone offering a useful observation. I looked at her for a long moment. "I know," I said quietly. "She was better at most things than I am." But something had shifted in that moment that did not shift back, because what Norma had said was not, on its surface, cruel. It was the kind of thing that sounds like honest reflection, but in the context of years of carefully calibrated criticism delivered in the language of concern, it was the sentence that finally allowed me to see the whole pattern clearly. Norma did not come to my house to support me. Norma came to my house to measure me, and I had been standing still for the measuring for years. My nephew, my brother's youngest son, I will call him Curtis. Curtis was 29 years old when he appeared at my door on a Tuesday evening with 2 bags and a story about a situation that had become untenable and a question about whether he might stay for a few weeks while he sorted himself out. I said yes, because that is what I did. The few weeks became a month. The month became 3 months. The 3 months became, I am not exaggerating here, 14 months, during which Curtis occupied my guest room and then expanded into the rest of the house the way water expands into available space. His friends came on weekends. The kitchen was used and not cleaned. The television was on at hours when I was trying to sleep. Mail arrived for him. His belongings migrated from the guest room into the living room and then into the space I used as a study. He borrowed my car twice and returned it both times with less fuel than it had when he took it.
I spoke to him about each of these things individually. Each conversation produced apology and brief improvement, followed by gradual return to the previous state. He was not cruel about any of it. He was not malicious. He was simply a young man who had found a comfortable situation and saw no compelling reason to make it less comfortable. And I let it continue because asking him to leave felt like failure, like abandonment, like the admission that I was the kind of man who turned family away. The night I collapsed was a Thursday in November. Not dramatic, I want to be clear about that. No chest pains, no ambulance, simple exhaustion manifesting as my legs deciding they were done. I was in the kitchen reaching for a glass, and I sat down the floor because standing was no longer available as an option. I sat there for several minutes. Curtis was in the living room 20 feet away. I could hear the television. I did not call out to him, not because I couldn't, because lying on that kitchen floor I was suddenly completely aware of something I had been avoiding knowing for 14 months. I was less comfortable in my own home than my nephew was. I had become a guest in the house I had shared with Constance for 31 years. I sat on that floor, and I thought about what Constance had said in the kitchen all those years ago, about the difference between someone needing you and someone needing what you provide. And I understood, for the first time with real clarity, which one Curtis needed. He needed the house, he needed the car, and the kitchen, and the address, and the stability my presence provided. He did not need me. I got up off the floor. I went to the living room doorway. "Curtis," I said. I need you to find somewhere else to live. I'll give you 30 days. He looked at me from the sofa with genuine surprise. The surprise of someone who has not been paying close enough attention to notice what was happening. Uncle James. That is not my name, but close enough. 30 days, I said. I'll help you find something. I went to bed. I lay in the dark, and my hands were shaking slightly, and I felt something I had not felt in 14 months, like the house was mine again. Beatrice Hollowell attended the same church I had attended for 22 years. She was not a friend. She was the category of person that long-term community membership produces. Someone you have known long enough that the familiarity feels like closeness, even when no genuine closeness exists. We served on the same community outreach committee. I drove her to meetings when her car was unreliable, which was often. I helped her navigate a dispute with her landlord that required several weeks of correspondence I wrote on her behalf. When she was ill one winter, I arranged a meal rotation among committee members and personally delivered food to her twice a week for 6 weeks. I am not telling you this to catalog my generosity. I am telling you this so you understand what I received in return, which was essentially nothing. Not nothing in the dramatic sense. Beatrice was not hostile. She did not insult me or take advantage of me in any obvious way. She simply existed in a state of complete expectation. Whatever I did was received without acknowledgement, as though it were the natural order of things, as though my function in her life was to provide assistance, and her function in mine was to receive it. One afternoon, I drove her to a medical appointment 40 minutes away, waited 2 hours, and drove her home. It had been raining. The return drive took nearly an hour in traffic. I helped her into her building with her bags. She turned at her door. Same time next week for the committee meeting, she said. No, thank you. No acknowledgement of the afternoon. Nothing. I walked back to my car in the rain, and I thought about 22 years of this, of driving and writing and organizing and arranging, of the specific emptiness of doing kind things for someone who has decided that kindness directed at them is simply how the world is supposed to work. The thing Beatrice said that finally completed the picture came 3 weeks later at a committee meeting. I had spent a weekend helping to organize the annual community food drive, logistics, volunteer coordination, 2 full days of my time. At the meeting, Beatrice mentioned it to someone else in passing. James handled all of that, she said. Well, that's what he does. Not, he was generous with his time. Not, we're lucky to have someone willing. That's what he does. As though my giving were a function, a feature, like a tool that sands or a pipe that carries water. I drove home from that meeting and I sat in my driveway and I thought about all 5 of them. Diane, Victor, Norma, Curtis, Beatrice. 5 people. 5 different shapes of the same essential thing. And then I thought about the hospital waiting room, the plastic chair, the nurse with the kind eyes. Is there anyone we should call? And I finally asked myself the question I should have asked decades earlier. Here is what I understood. The 5 of them were not the problem. I was. Not because I deserved what they did. I want to be clear about that. The way Diane converted every conversation into a transaction. The way Victor used me as an audience. The way Norma measured instead of supported. The way Curtis occupied my life like a tenant who had stopped paying rent. The way Beatrice consumed without acknowledging. None of that was acceptable and none of it was my fault. But all of it entered through the same door. And I had been holding that door open for 81 years. Because somewhere early in my life I had absorbed a belief so deep, it had become invisible. The belief that good people do not disappoint others, that refusing a request was a moral failure, that the measure of a man was how much he was willing to give before he gave out entirely. And every one of those 5 people had found that door and walked through it and made themselves comfortable on the other side. Not because they were uniquely predatory, because I had made it easy, because I had spent 8 decades signaling that my needs were negotiable and my limits were theoretical, and that if you push past them, I would adjust rather than resist. I had trained them, and sitting in my driveway after the committee meeting, I understood that the only person who could change the situation was the person who had created it. What I did next was not dramatic. Real change rarely is. I did not make speeches. I did not send letters. I did not have the confrontations I had imagined having for years and never quite initiated. I simply began choosing. When Diane called, I listened to the first 2 minutes and then I said, I can't help with this one, but I love you and I hope you find a way through it. And I held that boundary when she pushed against it, which she did twice before she stopped pushing. The third call was different. She called on a Sunday and she said, "How are you, Dad?" And there was nothing underneath it. No architecture of request, just a question. We talked for 40 minutes. I cried twice. So did she. It took 7 months to get there, but it got there. I stopped going to Thursday morning coffee with Victor, not with an explanation. I simply stopped scheduling it. He called twice, friendly, puzzled, and I was warm and vague, and let the friendship reduce to its natural level without the artificial infrastructure of weekly maintenance. I found I missed the idea of those Thursdays more than I missed the actual experience of them. I told Norma, the next time she made an assessment disguised as concern, that I appreciated her care, and that I had decided to manage my grief in my own way, and that I would let her know if I needed guidance. I said it without hostility. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. The visits continued, but they were different, quieter, more careful, and occasionally, unexpectedly, warm in ways they had never quite been before. Curtis moved out in 31 days. He found a place with 2 friends from work that was, by any honest assessment, better suited to his life than my guest room had ever been. He calls on my birthday. It is more than I expected. I resigned from the committee Beatrice and I shared. I did not replace the time with obligation. I replaced it with mornings at the library, long drives to the coastline, dinners cooked slowly for no one but myself. The silence that arrived in the wake of all of this, I had expected to grieve it. I did not grieve it. I sat in my kitchen one morning 6 weeks after Curtis left, and Norma had stopped measuring and Victor had stopped expecting, and Diane had made her first genuine phone call, and I drank my coffee in a house that was entirely mine again, and I felt something I did not immediately have a name for. Then I understood what it was. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or victory or the satisfaction of having been proven right. The specific peace of a man who has stopped spending energy he does not have on people who were not spending any on him. The peace of a house where the door is still open, but I am the one deciding who comes through it. Subscribe to this channel. Because every week there's a story here for the person who is still sitting in the plastic chair, still holding the phone going through the list, still telling themselves that this time it will be different, that this time the people they have given decades to will show up the way they showed up for them. These stories are for you. Like this video, if it found something in you. 1 second. It puts this in front of someone who is still holding a door open that they have every right to close. And leave me a comment. Tell me, is there someone in your life whose place in it you have never examined honestly? Someone who has been there so long that their presence feels like fact rather than choice? Tell me. Because the most important realization I had at 81 years old was not about any of those 5 people. It was about the door. It was about the fact that a door only stays open because someone is holding it. And the moment you stop holding it, the peace you have been looking for your entire life is standing right there on the other side, waiting. It was always waiting. You just needed to close the door to find it.